Hello, friends, and welcome to the National Constitution Center and to today's convening of America's Town Hall. And of course, happy Juneteenth to all of you. I'm Tom Donnelly, the Chief Content Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm so excited to be with you here today. I can't wait for this discussion. Before we dig into the content of the discussion, first, just wanted to flag a few upcoming events that we have to close out our current town hall season. On July 1st, leading international and national security law experts Harold Koh, Deborah Pearlstein, and Matthew Waxman joined Jeff Rosen for a conversation exploring the updated edition of Koh's landmark book, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century. And on July 9th, I'm excited to say that we will hold our annual Supreme Court review in partnership with ADL. It'll be held live at the National Constitution Center. We'll also stream it online. It's going to feature legal scholars and Supreme Court analysts, including Erwin Chemerinsky, Miguel Estrada, Marianne Franks, Gregory Garr, and Frederick Lawrence. The moderator will be journalist Amy Howe, and we will also feature remarks from Dahlia Lithwick. To view our full calendar of events and register to join us for these programs, visit constitutioncenter.org/town hall. Also, just as always, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen throughout our discussion today. I'm going to try to work in as many of your questions as possible as we get through our discussion. So now to introduce today's guest, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. He's a New York Times bestselling author and a former president of the American Academy of Religion. He's also on the Morehouse College Board of Trustees and frequently appears in the media as a columnist for Time Magazine as an MSNBC contributor. His most recent and, might I add, magnificent, inspiring, challenging book is We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm so looking forward to the conversation. And please call me Eddie.
Oh, excellent. Well, Eddie, thank you. Today, as I said, today is obviously, Juneteenth. So maybe before we turn to your powerful new book, let's begin there. Can you just tell us a little bit about the importance of this day?
Well, I think, it's an extraordinary day on the nation's celebratory calendar in the sense that it allows us to focus on the history of slavery and our very vexed and complicated journey around the issue of freedom. And so here we have this moment, what you might describe as delayed freedom, right? Where you have the enslaved in Texas, in Galveston, Texas, hearing General Order Number 3 from General Gordon Granger, realizing that they are free, although many probably knew. Texas was still in open rebellion, as it were, even in 1865, even though it's a couple of months after Appomattox. There is still this sense that the South is still trying to hold on in the face of this. And so what we have here is the Emancipation Proclamation, January of 1863. 2 years later, we have these folk experiencing the notion of freedom. And so it leads me to believe that freedom isn't an end. It is not something that is accomplished once and for all, and then we can wash our hands of it. Freedom is a practice. It's a practice in this country. It's an ongoing effort to instantiate in our lived relations. And so Juneteenth affords us an opportunity not only to think about the institution of slavery in relation to our democracy, but also to think about freedom and what it means for us in this moment. So it's not just a national holiday for Black people, it's a national holiday for the country at large to think about democracy itself. So it's in a wonderful moment, particularly in these vexed times that we are experiencing now.
Absolutely. I mean, you write so powerfully about the legacy and the wounds of slavery in your new book. And one of my favorite passages is near the end, and it features James WC Pennington, the first known Black student to attend Yale. Can you talk a little bit about his experience with enslavement, his critique, and what it tells us about the broader legacy of slavery?
Yeah, I mean, James W.C. Pennington becomes such an important figure for me because he's Frederick Douglass before Frederick Douglass, right? He's the first African-American to receive an honorary doctorate, the first Black person to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg or Heidelberg University, right? And so he's writing and he's thinking, he publishes his slave narrative, The Fugitive Blacksmith. And there we see him struggling with what the institution of slavery has done to him. And there's this extraordinary moment in the text where he's saying that there's one thing that he could never forgive the institution of slavery for, and that it deprived him of education. It deprived him of the means to engage in what I would call this kind of self-cultivation, right? And why is that important? He says, all that I've wanted to do is to make myself more efficient for good. I mean, it's just an extraordinary formulation. But slavery robbed him of the tools in some ways, right? He said, I've spent a lifetime trying to rid my tongue of the sound of the institution. But there's certain things that I cannot replace because I was not exposed to them as a young person. So for me, what Pennington reveals in that moment is that self-cultivation is not just simply an attention to reaching for higher forms of excellences, right? It's not just simply an individualized effort. The world as it's organized matters, because if the world is organized in such a way that prevents you from reaching for higher forms of excellences, it becomes a very difficult and daunting task. So Pennington, who came out of slavery, who could not read or write, who had skill sets, but was not, shall we say, formed by way of exposure to ideas in text, right, makes himself into this figure. But he has to work against the tide of slavery itself. And so he becomes this extraordinary example for me of the power of the human will and the evil of slavery itself. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, it makes me think about the fact, we're coming upon the 250th anniversary of America. I mean, on Juneteenth, how do we begin to think about that anniversary in light of the history of enslavement in America?
I'm working on a book right now, tentatively entitled America, USA. And what it is, I'm looking at all of the major anniversaries of the country, right? So, of course, we have 1776, and then think about the centennial. It's 1876, the symbolic end of radical Reconstruction, the contradiction of the country in full view. Think about 1926, the 150th, right? And what was happening in 1926 around immigration, coming out of the horrors of the Red Summer of 1919, the Johnson Immigration Act, what it represented in terms of the nation's grappling with its own ghost, as it were. Think about 1976, right? And what was happening in that moment. You get that horrible scene in Boston as children are being bussed, and you get the scene of the flag, the American flag, as folk are engaged in this pitched battle over will we educate all of our children? And so as we get to 2026, here we are finding ourselves still grappling with the contradiction that's haunted the country since its founding. Frederick Douglass put it this way in July 5th, 1852, right? He said that there was a reptile in the bosom of the nation that we desperately needed to remove. And here we are still dealing with that reptile coiled tightly in the heart of the country. So 2026 represents 250 years of us grappling with the contradiction that has shadowed, right, this fragile experiment in democracy.
Powerfully put. I mean, I think that's actually just a great transition to get into your new book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. And maybe just start for us with, what's your central claim here? If you wanted to, it's a very, as I said, very rich, very challenging book in many ways. But if you want to encapsulate what you'd want the audience to take home about it up front, at the beginning, what would it be?
That we can no longer afford to outsource our responsibility for democracy to others. That we cannot look to leaders or prophets or politicians or heroes apart from ourselves, that if democracy is going to be saved, if American democracy is going to be saved, we're going to have to do it. And we're going to have to understand our power in that regard. Now, that's the broader claim. And I try to get to that broader claim by way of my own specific journey through the African-American political tradition. And it's at the heart of the book, Tom, is a kind of cliche formulation, right? That if we are the leaders that we've been looking for, we have to become better people, right? We have to become better people. And I get this formulation in some ways from James Baldwin. Baldwin put forward the claim that the messiness of the world is in fact a reflection in part of the messiness of our interior lives. It's an Emersonian claim, right? We have to reach for higher forms of excellences. We have to become better people by leaving old selves behind, climbing that ladder, as it were. And so I'm suggesting that if we cannot leave the country in the hands of politicians or so-called prophets and heroes, that our capacity, that we have the capacity to do the necessary work to put us on a right path, on a just path. In order to do that, we have to fight, we have to struggle, but we also have to work on ourselves. Because the ugliness of our current times, I think, is in part a reflection of the ugliness that's in us.
I love that point, because I do think there is a tendency to try to look at our current moment and think about what sort of structural institutional reform can we make, because it feels like those are things we can control. But in a way, you're going back to an insight that goes all the way back to Madison, if not well before that. But the idea that virtue and character matter. It's not just checks and balances, not just separation of powers, but it's the virtue of the people within a republic, which are essential. I'm wondering, what are some of the qualities that you look at that are essential for us to become the sort of people that are worthy of a flourishing democracy and actually capable of creating it?
Well, I mean, I think we have to cultivate, first of all, you're absolutely right that Madison is at the heart of this, that the idea that democracies cannot work if we don't have certain kinds of virtuous people, right? And one of the interesting points about, one of the interesting features of our current malaise is that our characters have been compromised because we're all too often willing to cast democracy into the trash bin in defense of the belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to matter more than others. So even President Lincoln couldn't be the kind of man that his version of democracy required, because he was all too willing to compromise his soul when it came to the question of slavery, when it came to the question of race in some ways. And it seems to me that that reptile that we mentioned early on, coiled in the breast of the nation, right, is really about how it corrupts our characters, how it gets in the way of us becoming the kinds of people that democracies require. So what are the characteristics? Well, I think beyond basic decency, we have to cultivate the cognitive virtues of being open to deliberation, of being willing to understand when we're wrong, to engage in a kind of experimentation with regards to matters, right? So cognitive virtues that allow us to be open to growth, right? As well as kind of emphasizing notions of courage, of being caring and tending towards others, right? So it seems to me, right? Let me put it differently, Tom, that we have to exhibit the virtues that could give substance and content to a notion of the public good. That means we have to hold back the vice of selfishness, the vice of greed. And that, to me, involves a kind of other regarding, right? A kind of, as Baldwin put it, salvation is a going towards. But in order for that to happen, we have to cultivate, I think, the value of openness and loving and being loving, it seems to me, and decent. Yeah.
I love that. And I mean, it reminds me of a passage that you have near the end of your book about this process of self-cultivation. You say, self-cultivation on behalf of justice isn't about manners, decency, or civility, but about an idea of virtue that American democracy desperately needs because we are drowning among calloused hearts that refuse to change. And I think that's just such an interesting contrast between sort of manners, decency, and civility on the one hand, virtue on the other. Sometimes, if we think of a critique of discourse today, part of it is it's the coarseness, and as you've said many times in your book, it's the seeing the other as the enemy rather than as a fellow human being. But how do we sort of balance? How do we sort of think of the relationship between things like manners, decency, and civility, and virtue? How do we? It's hard to figure out exactly how we resolve that tension.
Well, part of what I was trying to do in that moment was to kind of hold off an easy appeal, right, to basic liberal notions that allow us to tolerate difference, right? And so I don't think the value here that I'm trying to uphold is the value of toleration, right? I teach at Princeton, and one of the interesting things about Princeton is that the central value is civility. Civility is equilibrium. right? So we want to, whenever there's conflict, we got to get to civility, right? And by virtue of that, sometimes we don't deal with the underlying reasons for the conflict. We just want to be civil to each other, right? And manners and decency can also be tethered to a certain kind of class disposition, right? Particularly when we think about 18th and 19th century invocations of manners and decency, right? Although decency has a different level of a different valence for me sometimes when I talk about the coalition of the decent. But virtue takes us deeper than toleration. Virtue takes us deeper than just simply talking to each other in a kind way, right? Or not being nasty or mean-spirited. Virtue has something to do with character formation. What are those elements that define who we take ourselves to be as persons, right? And virtue also, to my mind, Tom, makes the more, how can I put it? It reveals that the moral question is that the beating heart is the beating heart of the politics. And the moral question is, what kind of human being do you take yourselves to be? What kind of human being do you take yourself to be? And that moral question as the beating heart of a politics, right, shifts the center of gravity of our concern, right? Not just simply about maintaining equilibrium, keeping the ugliness beneath the surface, but rather, right, actually reaching for higher, as I've said, reaching for higher forms of excellences, or to put it more poignantly, just trying to be a better person, right? And I think that's key if we're going to finally turn a corner in this country, right? If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have a question from the audience from Ralph Hendrickson. Broadly speaking, are you hopeful for the near future?
I have to be hopeful because I have an abiding faith in the capacity of human beings to be otherwise. One of the challenging aspects of this book is that it has the philosophical architecture is explicit. I'm going to be engaging John Dewey and his American pragmatism. I'm going to be reading Ralph Waldo Emerson, and you're going to see all of this stuff happening that you're going to have to work your way through. But I think as a pragmatist of sorts, I have to have a fundamental faith in the capacity of human beings to change the world. With William James, all is not settled. But at the same time, Tom, I'm not naive. I come out of a blues-soaked tradition. And that reminds me of that line from B.B. King, nobody loves me but my mother, and she could be jiving too. Right? So even as I have faith in the capacity of human beings to be miraculous, I'm also not naive in their capacity for evil. And I think it's our understanding of those two things together that sets us on the right path for substantive and long-lasting change.
Excellent. And I'll work in another audience question here from
Sure.
Earl Mundell, where he said, was there a time when we citizens gave up our capacity to other leaders as opposed to ourselves? And can you give us basically some examples from history of people abdicating their democratic citizenship, as you're saying, to elite leaders?
Well, I think there's always the danger in representative democracy, right? That you think the only thing you have to do is to go vote, and then you go back to your day-to-day lives, right? And so we can think about this in the context of the beginnings of the Vietnam War. You can think about it in the context of those critical moments when the nation seems on the cusp of just collapsing. I'm thinking particularly around 19th century debates around the fugitive slave law. Think about what happened in 1850, right? And how that, so I'm thinking about a 20th century moment, and I'm thinking about a 19th century moment, and what everyday ordinary people gave over, right? And then what they had to do in response to what they relinquished, right? And what was fascinating is that we saw everyday ordinary people fighting the implications of the fugitive slave law of 1850. You saw it in Boston, you saw it in New York, saw it in Philadelphia. But there are other examples that we could talk about. But the main thing is, oftentimes we think of representative democracy as we just simply go, we vote, and then our responsibility is over, and we give it over to our representatives. And that, to my mind, is a form of abdication.
Excellent. I mean, another aspect of your book that I really love is sort of your recurrent grappling with the relationship between sort of what I would say, like historical memory heroes and, social change. That seems to be something you're obviously very interested in. I mean, what role do you see historical memory, like in a healthy sense? How can historical memory serve a purpose as we're pushing towards a better democracy or social change or whatever the goal is?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I'm grappling with my own sense of indebtedness, right? The way in which tradition shadows so much of what I do and how I think. I say in the book that I think the greatest generation America's ever produced is the generation of the mid-20th century. And the leaders that came out of that moment for me, right, are towering figures, right? They're godlike. And oftentimes we're asked to supplicate to those figures, oh, Dr. King, oh, these folks. The civil rights movement becomes the standard bearer of how we imagine struggle. So it's a vexed relationship to the past, right? And what do I mean by that? Sometimes the past can shackle our imagination as opposed to being the wind beneath our wings. So we cannot forget, because forgetting, right, allows the ghosts of the past to run rampant, unchecked, right? But we cannot be solely preoccupied with the past, because we literally become consumed by it, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do in the text is to understand the importance of tradition, right? The importance of owning it, possessing it for oneself, such that you and I can find our own voices, right? So that we can become part of the chorus, right? And as opposed to just simply engaging in what Ralph Waldo Emerson would say was a form of suicide, which, remember, he says imitation is a form of suicide, right? So history matters, memory matters, because if we forget, we're doomed to repeat it, to echo George Santayana in that moment, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, it reminds me of the Baldwin a quote that you have, that it takes strength to remember, it takes another kind of strength to forget, it takes a hero to do both. And it seems like that kind of reflective equilibrium is just so difficult.
It is. And you see it in T.S. Eliot's reflections on tradition. You see it, right, in Baldwin, as you rightly quote. You see it, right, I've been marinating, obsessed with T.S. Eliot's four quartets, right? Moving from Burnt Norton to the Dry Salvages, right? East Coker, I'm not quite there yet, but right, the way in which he's thinking about the relationship between time present and time past, right? How do we sit in this moment where history swirls around us? It's all around us. It's speaking to us, but yet we're here in our moment, in this moment, and we are unprecedented, in so many ways. You, Tom, you're unprecedented because there wasn't a Tom Donnelly before you, right? So how do we speak to the particulars of our current moment, informed by what John Dewey would call funded experience, right? That funded experience allows us to act in our current moment with a bit more than luck, right? Critical intelligence informed by the past, the lessons of the past, allows us to invade the present with a little bit more than luck, it seems to me. Yeah, indeed.
Excellent. And Bonnie Zitek has a question, and she brings in the other another element of forgiveness, and sort of how does forgiveness fit into this framework? Can we be too forgiving?
Yes, we can, but we have to understand how forgiveness works. There was that extraordinary moment, right, after the massacre in South Carolina in the church with Dylan Roof, right, in Charleston. And some of the family members stood up in court and they forgave him. And oftentimes that's read, at least in relation to African Americans, as somehow we have this superordinate moral gene that kicks in, that allows us to forgive all of the evil and the cruelty, when in fact the forgiveness wasn't simply about Dylan Roof. The forgiveness was about, how do we release hatred such that it doesn't turn around and consume us? Baldwin, for example, learned the lesson from his stepfather, right? As his father was consumed with what the world said about him, and as tuberculosis ate up his body, right? The reality of racism contributed to his madness. And what Baldwin was saying is that if we don't release the anger, if the hatred is not held at arm's length, we become the very thing we despise. We can easily become that. So forgiveness is working in both directions, right? It's a kind of soul maintenance. Because if we allow the righteous indignation to morph into bitterness and hatred and all-consuming anger, we can lose our souls.
Absolutely. We have another question from Joseph Ciratello about President Obama, where he says, how did Barack Obama's presidency, about which many were so helpful, figure into the current state of our democracy?
I think Tom, I think it represents, and this book began as a series of lectures at Harvard in response to Obama's presidency. I was concerned that the excitement around the symbolic significance of his election would lead too many of us to abdicate our responsibility. Now that, Obama's presidency was being read as the kind of culmination of the civil rights movement, which is just wrong-headed on so many different levels for me. But on another level, Obama's election represented, concretely, the threat of demographic shift. That the idea of the browning of America, that by 2050, America will be a majority minority nation. That it would no longer be a white nation in the vein of old Europe. And how that demographic reality generated all sorts of panic. And Obama's administration, this Black couple in the White House, was a kind of crystallization of that fear. And so it's not so much his policies, because he was a centrist Democrat, in the vein of Clinton in so many ways. But his body represents and represented, the horror of, for some at least, of this coming shift, that America will no longer be the country that we recognize. The barbarians will have finally overrun the wall, as it were. And so I think from that moment, from the moment in which Mitch McConnell said we will make him a one-term president, to the Tea Party, to the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act, there's been this attempt, as been the case throughout our history, of reining it back, of finding comfort once again in this idealized understanding of what America must always be, and that is a white nation in the vein of old Europe.
I mean, and part of what you also provide in your book is sort of a critique of, I would say, maybe like the last half century of American history, at least one phase of it, and sort of what that has done to us as a people in terms of shaping who we are, what we want, our capacity to find a common purpose, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about what those years have done to us, and kind of how we have to change to kind of meet our moment?
Sure, and I know this will be controversial for some folks, but you think about it. The mid-20th century Black freedom struggle has been described by historians, Tom, as a kind of second Reconstruction, an attempt to fulfill the broken promises of the first. And you think about the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 as the kind of the legislative culmination of that effort. But imagine just 15 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected with the mandate to undo it all. In 1981, we see the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act as part of a debate, and there's an intense debate whether or not we should do it. And Ronald Reagan finally concedes that he will reauthorize the VRA, but he says we must gut Section 5 eventually, which is what the Roberts Court eventually did. And so what we saw in 1980, the last major piece of legislation of the Great Society is the Fair Housing Act of 1968. 12 years later, Reagan is elected to undo it. And what we get with the ascendance of Reagan, and I'm not just simply blaming him, but we can call it Thatcherism, or we can call it neoliberalism, or however we want to describe it, is that we get an economic philosophy and a political ideology, in my view, and we can debate this, in my view, that transforms us from citizens in communion with each other to self-interested persons in competition and rivalry with each other. And that shift eviscerates any robust notion of the public good. So you have, for a moment, right, the communist threat that could be a basis for a kind of patriotic zeal, but it's running up against, right, this intensifying selfishness in which you see people abdicating responsibility for any notion of the public good. So much so that we get to a moment in 2021, and you have COVID, right, devastating our communities, and we can't muster, right, a sense of a common purpose, a sense of mutuality to respond to it as a nation. Instead, we fragment, we move into our silos. So I think, and of course in the 1990s, Tom, you have Robert Putnam writing Bowling Alone, where he uses the end of bowling leagues as an example of how we've become siloed, selfish. We move only among our tribes. And so I think over the last 50 years, we have been saturated with a political and economic philosophy that has in some ways eviscerated a notion of responsibility to each other. I don't know what the social contract is, what our obligations to each other are in this current moment anymore. And I think once that happens, right, alongside of other developments, democracy stands on the precipice.
Excellent. So, I mean, another feature here, I mean, the way you organize your book as a whole, we've gotten to sort of some of the big ideas, I think, but what's interesting to engage with the book in part is that your substantive chapters, you focus on particular figures in African-American history. So, Dr. King and Malcolm X and Ella Baker. And I'd like to, we have roughly a half hour left, maybe drill down and talk about those figures and what we can learn from them and how they can challenge us, maybe beginning with, the most familiar, which is, Dr. King. And you call that chapter on prophecy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Why that particular frame?
Well, I wanted to bring the prophetic down to the ground, right? There's a sense in which, we have Dr. King as this larger than life figure. And in my own life, and I should say this, that I'm trying to enact something that I'm commending. Self-cultivation in the pursuit of a more just world requires of us a kind of reaching for higher forms of excellences, which means that we have to deal with our own wounds, our own, try to figure out how we can muster the courage to become the leaders that we need, right? So I'm trying to do that work in the book. And so King and and Malcolm X are critical figures in my own development. So King is this larger than life figure. I remember in the my eighth grade history class, Miss Mitchell, who stood about 5'1" with a microphone because she had lost her voice as a singer earlier when she was a younger woman, teaching us Civil War history. And then of course, getting to the mid 20th century. And she asked me to recite Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. And back then, I'm dating myself, Tom, I had to go to the library and get the vinyl because I wanted to hear the speech. And I would stop it on the record player as I learned it and memorized it. And King became this larger than life figure for me in that moment, right? And then I went to Morehouse College, King's alma mater, and there's a large lifelike statue of King pointing at the campus. So we were socialized in Kingian philosophy. But what I wanted to do in the chapter was to bring him down to the ground, right? Not as this larger than life figure to which we're supposed to, engage in supplication, but a fragile, fallen figure. The prophetic isn't someone called by God who has the authority of God's law in his or her voice. Rather, the prophetic has to be understood as our ability to see beyond the opacity of now, to spy the future. And insofar as we can spy a future, we can use that future as a basis to critique the present. If that's true, We all have the capacity through our moral imaginations to be prophetic, just like King was. And remember, King was a young man straight out of seminary who had his first church in Montgomery. And the only reason why those folks chose him was because he had not been touched by the powers that be. History chose him. And he demonstrated in that moment capacities that each of us have, it seems to me. And I want to insist upon that. And that's what I tried to do in that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way in which we often think of the traditional prophet as, on the one hand, a truth teller, on the other hand, can be inspirational, so can inspire us to want to be great. But you also, note that the prophetic is when it's given to just a select few, that it could also be what you say, a quote unquote, a conversation stopper, and that this is difficult for democratic deliberation. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that obstacle?
Yeah, certain kinds of prophets, right? They know they have the truth. And so you have to be skeptical of how they function in a democratic society, right? And then sometimes they're larger than life, right? In the sense that I'm speaking the truth, and they're these charismatic figures. And so they call you and me to drop our current responsibilities and follow them. And so you must always be, and Sidney Hook helps with this, and others, you must always be skeptical, if you're committed to democracy, small d, of the prophet, capital P, because they can, or that person can eviscerate, right, the public domain in which we're all called, right, to be responsible in some ways, not to abdicate, but to embrace. And so part of what I try to do is to suggest, right, that the larger than life figure can be dangerous. Remember, imitation is suicide. And I don't want us to give ourselves over. I don't want to give myself over to Dr. King. Instead, I want to see him as an exemplar of what I'm capable of. That doesn't mean that all of us have the same capacities. No. I'm not trying to engage in that leveling practice. No. But what Dr. King reveals as an all too human example of the prophetic is that I can bring my talents to bear as well. And that's what we have to understand.
And I mean, interesting, this chapter seems to be almost as much about you wrestling with John Dewey as wrestling with Dr. King. And you already in your initial response here to this chapter brought up the idea of the moral imagination and its role here in democratizing the prophetic, what is the capacity of all of us to act as prophets. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how that process works, how the ordinary person could take on the prophetic?
So, the thing is that the moral imagination is that ability of us, of each of us, to see beyond our current conditions, right? What does it mean, right, to think about a set of circumstances that have not yet come into existence, or have not yet come into view? And how do we imagine it as a way to orient ourselves to the current moment, right? Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't freeze. How do we imagine it in relation to our current moment? And so the moral imagination, right, allows us to see not only ourselves, right, as fallen and fragile and finite, right, but it also opens up space for the exercise of critical intelligence, right? John Dewey will locate the moral imagination, and he uses this term in the exercise of critical intelligence. He uses this term entitled dramatic rehearsal, right? As we begin to address problems in the environment, we test, we experiment, we tinker. And by virtue of that, we engage in a kind of dramatic rehearsal. What would happen if I did X or Y, right? What would happen if I did A, B, C, or D? And as I test and engage imaginatively in pursuing these outcomes, right, I orient myself differently to the moment. And I want to say that particular practice, right, is where the prophetic is actually located, right? And each of us can do it, it seems to me. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it ends up being sort of a challenge for all of us, which I think is what's, one of the great things to reflect on in your book. I mean, one final thing I think to bring up about Dr. King before we move to Malcolm X and Ella Baker is, earlier we talked a little bit about the role of the past, the role of collective memory. And another thing that you bring out about Dr. King is, part of his push for reform is rooted in the American idea. It's rooted in the American founding principles. He's using the founding principles as a critique of the present to look towards a better future. Can you talk a little bit about that move and the power of that move? Also, whether there are any limits when you're operating within that mode? I'm curious how you
Oh,
reflect on that.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, by virtue of taking on the form of the American Jeremiah to invoke the late Sack Van Berkovich, the Harvard scholar of early American literature and American studies. That particular form of exhortation, which has been so critical to American political speech, you find yourself caught within the framework of American self-understanding. We use its terms, right? And Audre Lorde would ask the question: can you dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? Right. So what does it mean to invoke democracy, American democracy, as the framework? What does it mean to appeal to the Declaration of Independence, or to invoke Frederick Douglass again once he breaks from William Garrison, to think about the Constitution not as a slaveholding document, but as a document within which one can imagine the country anew, right? How does that constrain and limit the scope of one's politics? I mean, we have to grapple with that. We're not going to settle it in this conversation, but it certainly limits the scope or the field of battle in interesting sorts of ways. But Dr. King, in that moment, right, he is engaged in a kind of what scholars call, Tom, a kind of Black Jeremiah, that the country cannot become what it can become. The promise of the nation cannot be fulfilled until it does right by its former slaves. And what's interesting is that, ironically, those formerly enslaved folk will redeem the principles, right, sullied by those who are caught up in the idolatry of whiteness or racism or white supremacy and the like. So it's in this moment, it's a riff on what the late theologian Howard Thurman said about American Christendom. He said that the slave dared to redeem the religion profaned in its midst. So the adjective Black Christian, the adjective mattered in relation to the noun. White Christian, Black Christian, right? And so here you have King taking hold of the principles of democracy as his own and using them as a basis, right, to critique the nation as is and to imagine the nation as it could be. And I think that's just a powerful move, a tradition in which I stand in.
Absolutely. And I mean, we see it all the way at the beginning of the American story with petitions from Prince Hall and, free African Americans. We see it in David Walker in the 19th century.
Exactly.
Like it is a powerful tradition. And it is, it is just a thing that we see recurrent in the American reform. And so
exactly.
Love that you bring that out in Dr. King. Obviously you wrestle quite a bit with Malcolm X in this book. It sounds like Malcolm X also was really important to your own sort of personal development, your own personal journey. Can you talk a little bit about, you titled that chapter, "A Heroism in Malcolm X." Talk a little bit about, how you've, Malcolm's role in your life and how you've thought about him over time.
That was a very hard chapter to write, because I begin with a very painful moment in my own life with my own father, and trying to deal with a wounded masculinity, as it were. Right? What does it mean for me to grow up on the coast of Mississippi with this overbearing figure? I look just like my father, and I love him to death. Today we have a wonderful relationship, but when I was a child, I was deathly afraid of him. He could give me a glance, and I would almost cry, shake in my skin, as it were. And Malcolm became for me a resource to recapture a notion of manhood. Right? He became that figure. When I got to Morehouse, I went to college at a very young age. I was 15, 16 years old, and I remember this Morehouse senior upperclassman saying, "You're incomplete. You don't know who you are." And he gave me Malcolm's autobiography. And I went back to my dorm room and I read it from cover to cover that night. And it was like a conversion experience. To this day, I have my goatee because of it, right? And so what happened is that Malcolm became a kind of heroic figure for me because I found in him the language for my father's rage. I found in his witness, right, my own discomfort coming from Mississippi, seeing all of the things that I saw, hearing the stories, and of course, knowing the stories that weren't told, right? So he helped me kind of fashion myself as a Black man who's ready to engage in manly politics with other men, as it were, right? And Ozzie Davis has this wonderful, powerful formulation of Malcolm as our shining dark prince. That's how he eulogized him. But in seeing, but as I became older and reading more about him, particularly in Manning Marble's one Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, Malcolm became more human. He's trying to figure himself out. He's engaged in the arduous task of self-creation, right? And how he comes to us, right, matters. And so I say there's one way to read the biography in the light of, in light of Augustine's Confessions, or you could read the autobiography in light of Rousseau's Confessions, right? But what does it mean to read him as a guy who, to use Imani Perry's language, who's flailing and failing all the time once he leaves the Nation of Islam? And what we see and how I end up is that he's a wounded witness. So just as I did with Dr. King, I brought him down to the ground. You know, the man who doesn't want to smoke in public, the man who doesn't want to seem as he's as human as the rest of us. Malcolm is just as wounded as I am. And what does that mean for me? It releases me into a different way of imagining myself, not as a sycophant, an imitator of Malcolm's posture and pose, right? But rather to take the virtues of courage, his willingness to speak his mind, to speak truth as he understands it in the moment. And so for me, you know, it was an important journey, an important lesson, right? That I can do that, not that being be him, but be me, right? And I think we all need to understand that in a moment when the giants seem to force us to cower, you know.
For sure. And I mean, you know, in this chapter, as you're obviously wrestling with Malcolm X, you're also, you know, extended reflections just on the role of the hero in democratic life. And so you have this, you know, this great, you cite Sidney Hook for the idea that democracy should be deeply suspicious of heroes. And can you talk a little bit about sort of the role of the hero in a democracy, both some of the positive uses of heroism, also sort of the challenging side?
Right. And at that moment, I'm trying to think about the relationship between the hero coming out of Thomas Carlyle, right, where there's a disdain for ordinary people. And instead of using the heroic in the Carlylean sense, I'm more interested in the representativeness in the Emersonian sense. And that is that you have people who are doing extraordinary things, right? But the hero comes to us such that even better heroes can come, right? That's the point for Emerson, right? When you read representative men, right, it's not to just simply, oh my God, Swedenborg, oh my goodness, Plato, oh my God, Goethe. No. At the end of each chapter in those books, he's gonna find something that's not quite right about those figures, right? Because the aim is for their greatness to call forth something even greater. But the hero can also, right, when it's malformed, right, deny us that insight because they suck up all the oxygen. They become the center of gravity. And just like the prophet, they can shut down democratic deliberation. They can clean up the messiness of the democratic process, right? And that's always the temptation, right? When democracies become chaotic and messy and we have to work our way through it, some of us long for clarity and certainty and order, and that's when we allow for the strong man to make his way, oftentimes as a heroic figure, as a prophetic figure, and they clean up matters. And insofar as they do it, democracy is lost, right, in that moment. So I'm not denying the significance of prophets and heroes. I just don't like it when they're capitalized.
Yeah.
Like with capital P and capital H. I want to see them as representative figures, examples of what we all are capable of if we only try.
Love that. Which is the perfect transition to your final figure, who I can't help, but it just comes through in the writing how much you admire her. And so this is Ella Baker. If you could just talk a little bit about just Ella Baker herself, her vision and, her contributions to the civil rights movement, just to sort of tee up our discussion of that chapter.
Sure, Tom. I think, you're right. In the arc of the book, you have this wounded boy from Mississippi reaching for these male heroes, only to end up in the hands of this powerful Black woman who offers an understanding of democratic politics that I think that the nation should hear and embrace. So Miss Baker, without her, the mid-20th century Black Revolution doesn't make sense. She was a field secretary for the NAACP in the early 40s, going down into the Deep South, and at a moment when the NAACP carrying an NAACP card could get you lynched. So she's down there organizing. She's the first executive director of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the organization that Dr. King founds after the Montgomery movement. And he tries to organize all of these male preachers. I can only imagine what Miss Baker went through trying to organize these very difficult men in certain ways. And then, you think about 1960, those were those wildfire student sit-ins in Greensboro and in Nashville and Atlanta. And the students decided that they wanted to organize their efforts, and they meet at Shaw University. Well, why are they at Shaw, Tom? Because Shaw is the alma mater of, guess who? Ella Baker. And it's at that meeting that we get the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that organization becomes, in so many ways, the shock troops of the civil rights movement. They give us the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the like, right? And so Miss Baker's philosophy is that a strong people do not need strong leaders. I love that formulation, right? And she used to tell the SNCC organizers as they would go into the South, shut up and listen, you might learn something. Your task, she would intimate, your task is to create the conditions under which indigenous leadership could flourish. Not to helicopter in and tell people to follow you, but to understand that those people, that those sharecroppers in Mississippi and in Alabama actually have the capacity, right, to be the leaders that they need. And what you're charged to do is to create the conditions under which that leadership can emerge. And I think that model, right, is so important to my own understanding of democracy, small d.
And what the phrase you use associated with Ella Baker, is that of democratic perfectionism? Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, this is my attempt to bring that tradition across the tracks and let it be in conversation with the sage of Concord, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Remember, the through line of the book is self-cultivation in the pursuit of a more just world. Mm-hmm. When we struggle together and we struggle with the idea that each of us has the capacity, right, to exhibit a kind of courage, the virtues necessary for democracy to flourish, when we struggle in that way, we become better people. We become better people because it's in the going towards that salvation is found, to use Baldwin's language, right? It's in that politics of tending, which is local, close to the ground, that we can become better people in our association with others, right? And so perfectionism is this idea, right, of reaching for higher forms of excellences, of leaving a particular self behind. In order to leave that self behind, Tom, we have to be honest with who we are. We have to tell the truth about who we are, because if we continue to lie, we're going to be permanently docked in the station. So we have to confront ourselves. And when we struggle together, we are confronting, the ugliness of who we are in the midst of trying to build a more just world. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that she's saying to those young students, and she's saying to us, right, if we struggle in this way, we put ourselves on the path to becoming better people, which goes back to our first point, right? If we are the leaders we've been looking for, we have to become better people, which is my way of parsing the phrase democratic perfectionism, right? Doing the hard work to become better people, to reach for higher forms of excellence.
Excellent. And I mean, so, part of it is this self-cultivation. Part of it is, grassroots advocacy. We have a question from Reggie Ellis, and it makes me think about what are the roles of certain mediating institutions. And Reggie asks, will you speak to or share your thoughts regarding the continued relevance of the nation's historically Black colleges and universities and their continued impact on the full development of this liberal democracy?
Well, I'm a product of those institutions. I like to view them as barrier islands, right? And what I mean by that is that when you think about how barrier islands function, they break up the wind of the hurricane. So the hurricane isn't as strong. And so these institutions are places that allow a young country boy like me to understand himself in the most expansive of terms, right? But it also becomes the place where when the fever dream spikes, or when the winds of white supremacy are really ferocious, we are in these institutions and they fortify us in relation to those winds that allow us, right, to emerge, right, not only unscathed, but even better. So when you think about American history, you think about, that period at the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, from Plessy v. Ferguson to Brown v. Board of 1954. Rayford Logan described that early period, as the nadir, the lowest point in African-American history. But in fact, when you look closer, it's one of the most vibrant moments in African-American history. The creation of Black institutions, Black theater institutions, Black political organizations. We're doing all of this work. So those institutions, like HBCUs, many of which were created or founded in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? We see those vibrant spaces that allow for people like me to cultivate that inner sensibility, right? To cultivate that capacity to imagine myself in the most expansive of terms. And Lord, do we need them today, given the vexed conditions that we face as a country.
Absolutely. And so, we probably have time for one more question. And I wanted to sort of end,
Sure.
End our conversation the same way you end your book, which is you end with this just wonderful quote from Toni Morrison about the complexity of the world. And I'll read it and then just sort of ask why you ended your book there. Here's Morrison. Of course, there is cruelty. Cruelty is a mystery. But if we see the world as one long brutal game, then we bump up into another mystery, the mystery of beauty, of light, the canary that sings on the skull. Unless all ages and all races of man have been deluded, there seems to be such a thing as grace, such a thing as beauty, such a thing as harmony, all wholly free and available to us.
Yeah, and then the last two words of the book, now fly. Right? So this is the hold back pessimism. This is the hold back the view that, the world as it is anti-Black, and there's nothing we can do about it. Right? I just totally disagree. I think it doesn't require that we throw away democratic principles. That wonderful reference, she's riffing on Annie Dillard when she says the canary that sings on the skull, right? That ugliness, cruelty is a definitive feature, a defining feature of our lives. We cannot deny that. But if we recognize it, we also must understand the power of grace and beauty that can be evident in our tending to each other. That when we understand the fullness of our capacity, right, to be different, to be together differently, America can in fact be saved. It can be imagined differently, more powerfully, a fulfillment of its promise. I refuse to give that up. I can't give it up. And so to invoke Morrison at that moment, Tom, is to invoke a kind of hope that's necessary for us all to fly.
Excellent. What a wonderful way to end this conversation. Eddie Glaude Jr., for sharing your wonderful book with our audience. And just it was just an absolute delight to speak with you. I hope that we could bring you back to the Constitution Center many, many times in the future.
Man, thank you so much for everything, Tom. Thank you for reading the book so carefully. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eddie.